Welcome to Tim Kirby Russia, where I, radio talk show host and a legendary political analyst in Russia, Tim Kirby, tell you about the world via the lens of Russia, how Russia sees things, because guess what? The mainstream media never will. And today's guest is George Pearce, who has been living in the Crimea since way before it became part of Russia again, and he has been writing about it and more for all those years. So he's quite a prolific writer, and he has a lot of big opinions to share, and perhaps he'll reveal some secrets about the Crimean referendum that maybe you didn't know. But before that, let's actually talk about this big word, referendum, because Russian forces have moved into the Hersonskaya region of what was Ukraine, and now they say there's going to be a referendum to join Russia. And besides the Hersonskaya region, the Donetskaya and Luganskaya regions are of course going to have their own referendum. No shocker there. But one thing that may surprise you is very soon, maybe even after this recording comes out, South Ossetia will have already had a referendum to join the Russian Federation. That could really change things, especially to the south of Russia, but we'll see how that goes. Now, I have one major point to make about this whole concept of referendums. Now, we're talking about the referendums that are going to happen now that may seem, let's just put it this way, with Russian tanks and soldiers everywhere, and especially like in the case of South Ossetia being extremely dependent on Russia, how fair could these referendums be? Well, that's up to you to decide. But back in 2014, when Ukraine was in the fires of a coup d'etat or revolution, civil war, the beginning of a civil war, well, the question was a lot more open, and perhaps the results could have been a lot more objective. Because one thing that especially the Russian media and a lot of Russian political analysts were pushing back in 2014 was, okay, there's this revolution. Obviously, the people who are fighting for the Maidan hate us. They are Russophobes. They despise Russia. They're neo-Nazis and this, that, and the other. Why don't we just have a national referendum in Ukraine and make everyone happy? Whoever votes to join, the West and the European Union will go that way. Whoever votes to join Russia will go this way, and everyone will be happy. And to be honest, if you think about it, wouldn't that be the simplest solution, the most humane solution? But of course, that didn't happen. Why didn't it happen? Because Washington was still very sure of its ability to maintain the monopolar world, and you don't maintain a monopolar world by giving away territory to some other pole. You don't acknowledge that they have any interests or desires or will to act. They are a non-entity. So Washington wanted to take the entirety of Ukraine. And that's where we got 8 years of war that is now transformed into what I call the hot phase of the war, or the Russian media calls the special operation in Ukraine. And already even before the special operation began, definitely over 10,000 people, but maybe tens of thousands of people already met their end because of this. And now definitely we're getting unfortunately close to, maybe it's already been 100,000 people overall since the Maidan. So, it's becoming quite the tragedy there. But there's one thing that I'd like to point out, that if Washington wasn't so short-sighted, if Washington could have just acknowledged that the multipolar world is somewhat, let's say, inevitable, but on the rise, to be honest, they probably actually could have kept a lot more of the Ukraine than one would think. Because again, going back to the mentality of 2014, okay, this is 2014. This is before the migrant crisis in Europe. This is before the COVID crisis. This is before Russia's new sort of economic games have made the ruble really gain on the dollar, and the Western economy seems to be falling apart. This is way before all of this. This is still a time when Europe looked inherently cleaner, nicer, vastly more wealthy, vastly superior because of some mysterious reasons. As we've talked about in this program before a few times, Russia has this deep inferiority complex. And in 2014, there wasn't as much evidence to go against that inferiority complex. Well, so what do I mean? I mean that if they would have had the referendum to sort of split Ukraine into two parts in 2014, I wouldn't be surprised if, given an objective vote, that the country would have been divided maybe evenly half and half, or maybe even the West would have been convinced, or would have been able to convince many of the people in Ukraine to actually go to the West, because that's where the money is. So again, if we were going to have a national referendum to sort of divide the Ukraine, the West's media machine could have done a fantastic job with it. But now the West's media machine has been working with Kiev to create all sorts of propaganda videos during this war to show that the Russians are losing, goes to Kiev, Snake Island, all this other stuff. But the facts are the facts. You can make all the propaganda you want, but who has their forces on Snake Island? Who's winning the war? You see what I mean? Washington really should have played to its strengths in 2014, and it would have a lot more territory, a lot closer to Moscow than it will in the future. Okay, so let's talk to our guest, prolific writer and longtime Crimean resident George Pearson. George, before we begin, could you tell us how you found yourself in the Crimea during the Ukrainian phase?
I've always seen the U.S. going in the direction that it went. I was right about it. I wanted a place outside the U.S., a completely different system. I've always been looking for a place to buy in a country that's not connected to the U.S. I was working in Afghanistan, and I took my R&Rs in Ukraine, and really liked Crimea. I met a girl there, got to be real good friends with her, and she helped me get some property there, and ended up getting married and having kids and buying a place that became my home.
So, George, before the interview, you told me that there are these sort of like key lies that keep being spread over and over again about the Crimean referendum, about the Crimea today, and so on and so forth, that don't allow you to sleep at night because they're so annoying. Could you tell us some of these?
That it somehow historically belongs to Ukraine, which it doesn't. That there's some sort of Crimean people that were Russianized. That's even in the U.S. Rand McMillan handouts, or I guess that they had some hack writer doing it for them now, so it didn't look like propaganda. But that Russia has always run things through some sort of unofficial channels and mafia. That's not true at all. I could go on and on all day what Americans believe about it. That Russia invaded it and took it over, and the referendum was at gunpoint. That's just all absolute false.
Now, you mentioned to me off camera some very interesting stories about the U.S. military and their attitudes towards the Crimea. Could you share those with our audience?
I was a military contractor in Afghanistan, and the first thing that happened is I got to spend all day with a four-star general. We were rolling around all over the camp, stealing concrete barriers from people. We needed lots of them. We're building a Marine camp, and there wasn't enough barriers, so people don't want to turn loose of their barriers, and I wasn't authorized to take them. So this general rolled around with me. We marked them. So we spent the day together. We're making chit chat, and I told him I had a place in Crimea, in Sevastopol. And his ears perked up, like kind of like a dog's do. And he said, "You hang on to that place, son. That's going to be a NATO base someday." He actually said that. That was, I think, probably about 2007. That was long before the referendum. I don't know if that's just his opinion or he had inside information. He was a four-star general. But then later, I had a web crawler. I subscribed to a service that goes through all the government contracts because I was always looking for something better than KBR. And I'd see the contracts coming up and who's bidding on them, and I could hire in specific areas. And they had contracts coming up in Sevastopol, Ukraine. They were putting out bids to find somebody to renovate the Russian Black Sea Fleet buildings. The U.S. government was asking for bids on that. That's really interesting. They don't own them. They don't have anything to do with it, but they were putting bids out for contract. And this was probably, I know I was still in Afghanistan. I was probably about 2008 or so. And it made it on the web too. People were putting that out and saying, "Look what they're doing." Right after the coup, people pulled that out from the memory hole and showed it on the internet. But I saw when it came out, the contract for renovating buildings in Sevastopol. They had designs on it. They were planning on taking it away from Russia through this coup and making a NATO base out of it. It's insane that they thought they could do that. I like to think there's a room in the Pentagon somewhere with a model of Sevastopol on it. And in 2014, when they had a referendum, there's a bunch of generals sitting around with their lips sticking out, pouting because they didn't get what they want. There's a lot of sour grapes coming out of that now.
So, George, what has happened in the Crimea since it changed hands? What kind of developments are happening, or is everything basically the same, but with a different flag on the government buildings?
Well, it's been a slow process in some regards. That's just my perception of it. Like I said, I was naive. I thought they would kick out all these corrupt bureaucrats and put some more honest ones in, but that didn't happen. They've been leaning on them. I mean, you don't hand money over the table anymore. They make all kinds of obstructions for you because that's their habit. I don't think they can do anything else. They just can't do their job like they're supposed to. I'm not talking about all of them, just a lot of them. They just refuse to give you the papers that they demand that you have anyway. They'll find all kinds of problems in hopes that you find a back channel and get them some money, because that's what they've always been doing. But they've been leaned on enough where they really can't do that much anymore. And I think things have really been cleaned up in that regard. Now, physically, the place has been transformed. It used to be falling apart. There was no maintenance on anything. The roads were awful. The parks were run down and shaggy, and broken playground equipment everywhere, old wore out Soviet equipment, even equipment in my neighborhood. The buildings were all put up in the late 50s, early 60s. They had wooden playground equipment. It was probably the original stuff, and it was all rotten and falling apart. Well, since the referendum, I guess within a year of the referendum, they started tearing all that stuff out and re-innovating like everything at once. There's a huge park near my house. I mean, it's got to be like 80 acres or so. It's pretty big. They redid the whole place. It took them a year, but it's done. They pulled out all the stops. They did it to the nines. They did a real good job. They made a beautiful, fantastic place out of it. It was broken asphalt and overgrown and just nothing there. It wasn't maintained. The Ukrainian officials got money to maintain things with, but they just stole all of it. They've renovated the schools in my neighborhood. They finished the big park, Akmavat, I think is the name of it. I'm probably not pronouncing it right. And then there's another park on the other side of my neighborhood that they've just finished and opened up again. They renovated this huge park, Park Babiti, over on the other side of town. They renovated everything, new pavement, new tiles, new benches everywhere, new playground equipment, and it's nice stuff too. It's not plastic crap. Real cutting edge looking playground equipment in some of the places. It was all run down and crappy and kind of dangerous, really. Some of the equipment they had there. It's been a huge difference in the appearance of the place. All new pavements, all new. The first thing they did too is they put new water lines everywhere in the city, including my neighborhood. They dug up the old ones. They put in new lines, new power lines. Paved the roads, nice fresh asphalt everywhere. Put up new signs everywhere. Crosswalks are good. It's pretty nice.
Now, what do people in the West not understand about the situation in the Crimea and about your life there?
They, most people in the U.S., and I even know some military officers and educated people that couldn't find it on a map, so there's not a whole lot of hope of knowing about the history of the place. They think it must be dangerous. They get their perception of Russia from action movies where it's all dark, creepy, dissolving, disintegrating Soviet infrastructure with all these criminals running around shooting each other. That's what they think it is. They get it from the freaking movies. And it's clownish, really. It's cartoonish, but that's what they believe. And they're worried about me. Some of my friends and family, they think it's some sort of horrifying, dangerous, dark, dank place. Now that Russia took over, they didn't take over. The people there are Russian, and they voted to rejoin Russia, just like they did in right after the dissolution of the Soviet Union. They had a referendum back then, 91. They had another one in 94. They were ignored, and finally they got one that took.
What aspects of life in the Crimea are really difficult due to all these crazy sanctions? I mean, can you have a bank account or a bank card? Do you have cell phone service? Is there the internet? What is this all like on a day-to-day basis?
The phone service is funky and the banks are funky because it's Crimea and it's sanctioned. The Russian government has made two separate systems, so the sanctions don't really bother the mainland. They're isolated to Crimea. Yeah, it makes it a little harder. My chip I have on my phone doesn't work on the mainland, and I get one on the mainland. It doesn't work in Crimea. the bank cards that work in Crimea and the main line to either one, but your bank is really, really localized, focused. I can't I can't send money from the U.S. to my bank card in Crimea. I have to have a bank card on the mainland in order to transfer money. And the bank cards, those particular bank cards, are tied to your phone and your phone chip. And so if the phones have a disconnect, it makes things difficult. Any interface you have with a bank, your phone rings and you have a code that you put in. Well, it doesn't always work if I'm in Crimea and I'm getting things done, but I'm finding ways around it and just have to deal with it.
So how has the Biden era changed things in the Crimea, or has it not really had much of an effect on anything? Is this new Biden Democrat way of doing things a big deal?
I don't think Biden matters for much of anything except, demoralization of campaign of the American people. I don't think his policies mean anything. Nobody, I don't think even Trump would normalize relationships or recognize Crimea because all this is coming from the military industrial Congress critter media money carousel. I could draw diagrams and show you how it works. I know how it works. These people that are making decisions and have power and influence in Washington and determining your foreign policy are getting profits off this chaos and this oppression. And one of the tools that they use for it is refusing to recognize Crimea.
So here's something I've been curious about. How do Crimeans feel about the situation in the Donbass? Because they were sort of spared from all this. They weren't invaded by these neo-Nazi hordes who are torturing locals, putting landmines everywhere, trying to break the will of the people there, banning their language, so on and so forth, right? They also didn't have to experience a civil war. So how do they feel about this dynamic where they were saved, but their neighbors were in some ways kind of left to the dogs?
They know how their government works. As I said, the way they're squeezing the bureaucrats and the oligarchs to play fair and be nice and obey the law, they squeeze real slow and real careful, and they know that. People know it. There's a lot of refugees from Donbass and Crimea. One of her daughter's friends is a lawyer. I think he's from Lugansk. And, they sat down and had tea with us and talked about things. I think both my daughters have music lessons, and their instructor, he's from Donetsk, and he speaks a little English, and they're accepted in Crimea. Everybody knows somebody from the Donbass in Crimea. Everybody knows somebody that came there to get away from it, get away from being shelled all the time. Crimeans support that. I think they're very patient. They know they can't just absorb it or, have a referendum and have it become part of Russia overnight like they did Crimea. They know that it wasn't time for it. Maybe time now, or at least recognize them as independent republics. It stirs up a hornet's nest with the West. What are they going to do? Sanction us? I mean, come on. Crimeans support it big time. They're not disappointed, I don't think. I think they got a little more maturity and realism in their political outlook about how things really work. They've been through it.
So anyways, guys, if you enjoyed this video and you like the opinions coming out of my big fat mouth, then join up on my Telegram channel. That's Tim Kirby Hardcore on Telegram. Link, of course, in the description.